Darkcast Network, the light shines brightest on our indie podcasts.
Content warning ahead. This podcast contains very sensitive topics such as missing persons, unsolved cases, haunted houses, and paranormal activity. These type of topics can contain very upsetting and sensitive details and stories. Please listen responsibly. Welcome to Missy Mysteries. I'm your host, Keely. This is a true crime and paranormal podcast. If this is your first time listening to Missy Mysteries, for the month of November, I have chosen to focus on cases where law enforcement or the justice system plays a part in why these cases are unsolved. This is in hopes to not only highlight what we need to see change, but the injustices that the victims and their families have faced in the fight to find justice. I have covered topics like this before, and it is so important to highlight, but I also want to make it clear that I have covered cases where law enforcement or the justice system have played an important part in finding justice. There are times where people do their jobs they should, and there are unfortunately a lot of times where racism, classism, sexism, and just plain ignorance and mistakes play a part in preventing finding justice for victims of violent crimes. In today's case, racism definitely plays a part in not only a cold case, but the death of an innocent boy. I will be covering the case of 11-year-old Betty Binnicker, 7-year-old Mary Thames, and 14-year-old George Stinney Jr.
Hey there, it's Audrey, producer at Spike & Crown Studios. Now's your chance to support a 3D animated horror film and get some awesome rewards in return. Check out spikeandcrown.com and visit our Kickstarter to make a pledge. You'll get our cutest dog, Sancho, the heroic basset hound, in full plush form. He's super cuddly, has a magnet nose, and comes with a real pet collar. Best of all, you can get producer credit, limited edition trading pins, digital collectibles, and much, much more. Check us out at spikeandcrown.com. That's SPIKEANDCROWN. There's a link at the top so you can visit our Kickstarter page, watch the trailer, claim these amazing rewards, and become a horror film producer. Isn't that cool? Once again, it's spikeandcrown.com, and we're live on Kickstarter.
Before starting today, I want to highlight two creators. The first is Death Row Last Meals on TikTok, and I believe YouTube as well. They create true crime content about killers' last meals on death row, and this is where I found out about this case. Second is the podcast Teachers Talk Crime. They did an amazing job covering this case and linked a lot of amazing sources in their episode notes. They covered the case I will be talking about on episode 27 if you want to take a listen. This case starts on March 23rd, 1944, with 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames. Unfortunately, I do not have a lot of information I can tell you about the girls in their life, mostly because of how much attention this case gets around the crime in specific and how long ago it happened, that I have a hard time finding very in-depth details on the victims. From what I could find though, it seemed that the girls were very happy and loved by their families. Both girls were born and spent their lives in Alcolu, South Carolina. And on the day of March 23rd, the girls went to school just like any other day, and after school, they took to their bikes on a journey to find some maypops. If you are like me, you probably have no clue what the heck maypops are. So I looked up maypops, and I found out that they are little yellow edible fruits that grow on passion flowers, which are beautiful purple lavender flowers native to North America. The girls, in search of these flowers, had to cross the train tracks in Alcolu. It's important to highlight that the girls crossed the train tracks because we are touching topics like racial injustice and segregation. At this time in North Carolina, Jim Crow laws were very much still in full swing. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws in America that enforced racial segregation. In Alcolu, these laws meant that one side of the tracks was where the white people lived, and the other side of the tracks was where people of color lived. When the girls crossed the tracks, they came across two children of color playing in their yard, a 14-year-old boy named George Stinney Jr. and his little sister Amy. Betty and Mary asked them where they could find maypops, and to this day it's unclear if George and Amy told them where they could find them or if the kids even knew where they could find them. The girls then left George and Amy with or without an answer, but when the nighttime came, the girls did not return home. Search parties, including George's own dad, George Stinney Sr., searched for Betty and Mary. The search parties spent all night looking for Betty and Mary, but the girls weren't found until the next day. On that next day, a local reverend found 11-year-old Betty and 7-year-old Mary deceased in a watery ditch under a broken bicycle. At this point, I want to know I will be going through the doctor's findings, including the girls' deaths, and it may be upsetting. I normally leave out as many details as possible, and I will be doing this for the girls, but some of the details that may be important to this case are still very upsetting. Mary and Betty were examined after their death by Dr. Ashbourne Cecil Bozart. He was able to determine that the girls showed no sign of struggle with the killers. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Mary had one puncture wound that went through the forehead and the skull. Betty received 7 blows to the head that left her with shattered bones in her skull. He then concluded their cause of death was from penetrating trauma to their skulls, and the wounds were most likely caused by a round instrument about the size of a head of a hammer. Although he concluded that it was about the size of a head of a hammer, no weapon was actually found on scene, which officially left the weapon used in this killing as unknown. The police working in 1944 believed that this weapon was a railroad nail or like iron pole, but when the case was reopened in 2004, the new look at the case believed that the weapon was most likely a hammer. In the end, though, the weapon used in this attack is unknown and will most likely remain this way. The police who worked the case in 1944 didn't find much evidence at all, really, while investigating the death of the 2 girls. The one thing they did find was a witness who told them that the day of the girls' death, just the day before, the last people they spoke to was George and Amy. There were also rumors that the girls had gone to the house of an important white family that day, but this was never investigated or looked into. That day, on March 24th, shortly after the girls had been found, while home alone, the police went to the house that George lived at with his siblings and his parents. While Amy hid in the chicken coop behind the house, George and his older brother John were arrested and taken into police custody. At the police station, John was released pretty shortly after, but George was held and interrogated by the police for hours. George was interrogated without any parents or representation, and after only a few hours, the police claimed that George had confessed to the murders of the 2 girls. They said that George had told them that he wanted to have sex with Betty and committed the crime. At this time in history, normally a confession would have to be handwritten, but George's confession was not. The evidence of his confession comes from a statement from the investigator H.F. Newman, in a statement where he said, "I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession telling me where to find a piece of iron about 15 inches long. He said he put it in a ditch 6 feet from the bicycle." Although keep in mind that no weapon had ever been found, even with George telling the police where it was. From here, George was kept in custody, and when news broke that George was charged or confessed in the murder of Betty and Mary, an angry mob of citizens wanted to take justice into their own hands. Luckily, the police were able to predict that this was going to happen, and he was moved out of the county without anyone being told where he was going to be, not even his own parents. George's trial for the murder was expedited, and only a month after being arrested, on April 24th, he was taken to trial for the murders. During the trial, George was surrounded by strangers. The day that George was taken from his home was the last day any of his family ever saw him. When he was moved, his family was never told where he was going, and when his court date came, his family had been kicked out of their home because it was company housing, and his father was fired from his job when news broke, and his family had to flee Alcolu for their own safety, leaving behind most of their belongings. This also prevented his family from being able to get into the courtroom to be there for George on this day. George was given a court-appointed attorney named Charles Powden, but even as his lawyer, Powden did the bare minimum to defend George. He never called any witnesses or pulled any evidence, although the only evidence in court was the statement the police had about George's confession. George's trial only took 2 hours before the jury of all white men took 10 minutes to find him guilty of both Betty and Mary's murders. George, on that day, became the youngest person in modern United States to be sentenced to death, and on June 16, 1944, he became the youngest to be executed. On June 16th, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was taken to the electric chair carrying his Bible under his arm. He always had this Bible on him, and it was then used as a booster seat for George since he was too small to fit in the electric chair. George's last words were, "No, sir," answering a man who asked him if he wanted to say anything about what he had did. George was little, he was only 90 pounds, and this meant that he needed not only a booster seat, but nothing fit him like it was made to fit the men before and after him. After a very upsetting execution on the electric chair, George's life ended on June 16, 1944, at the age of only 14. The last time his family ever saw him was March 24, 1944, but they never felt like George could have done this along with others in the community who may have been afraid to speak out. Amy has gone on to share that her brother never left her that day, and his family never stopped fighting for what they believed and to clear his name. In 2004, they got the case reopened, and 70 years after the murder, on December 16, 2014, George got a retrial. That day, Judge Carmen Mullen ruled that George was denied due process in 1944 and reversed the guilty ruling that George received that day. Judge Mullen shared that she cannot say if George did it or didn't do it, but in this process, she was able to see that he was convicted of a crime without proper defense, no written confession, no bloody clothes, and no weapons. With Judge Mullen's ruling, George's sister Catherine just shared that she was thrilled because justice was overdue for her brother. His sister Amy cheered over the phone, just thrilled that they cleared George's name. Although not everyone was thrilled with this ruling, the family of Betty swears to this day that George is guilty of the girls' deaths. Her sister was adamant that they leave the case alone, but since her passing, Betty's niece, born after the death of her, is the one who is active in the media, even working with bloggers to share her side and the fact that she believes clearing George's name was just wrong. For me, I think ultimately, no matter what happened, the judge did put it in the best way. George was denied due process. It's hard for me to believe the police knew only hours after finding the girls deceased to know that George was the person who committed this crime. Ultimately, this leaves the question of who committed the crimes against the girls. At this point, the girls would have been in their 80s, and George would have been in his 90s. Whoever committed these crimes and took the lives of not only the girls, but allowed George's life to end for them is most likely passed away at this point. There has been rumors of deathbed confessions about the girls' murders, but we may never know. I can only hope that all three of these kids are able to find peace in the afterlife. I also hope that we can learn from the injustice around this case, and we can do our best to protect those who need it today. We have started to make steps, such as the one made on November 17, 2021, when a bill was passed in the name of George to pay the families of those who lost their loved ones to execution after they were wrongly convicted. But we still have a lot of progress to be made. At this point, I'm going to thank you for listening to this episode. If you like the podcast, leaving a review and sharing the podcast is always so helpful, and I truly appreciate any love you can show. I normally tell you I will see you next week, but since it's Thanksgiving here in America and holidays are a little chaotic, I'm going to be taking a break and sharing some content from my friends at the Darkcast Network. Please be safe in whatever travels you may have if you celebrate the holiday. Be safe in general, and I will see you on the next episode.